Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about ergonomics and how that matters for professional translators, but also for anyone who spends a lot of their time working at a desk and staring at a computer screen. My name is Maureen Ahrensberger. I'm Professor for Translation Studies at the ZHAW Institute of Translation and Interpreting, and it happens I'm in this picture as the one in the green blazer behind the Swiss and American flags. That's partly appropriate because indeed I am Swiss, but I'm Canadian and not American. Ergonomics has mattered in translation and interpreting for a long time. I'm not the first person by far to talk about it or think about it. In 2002, there was a famous study published by Ike called the Workload Study, looking at interpreters' working conditions. Interpreters were the first language mediation professionals to really pay attention to how working conditions can affect performance. When you're locked in a small booth for hours at a time and have to concentrate on a very complex cognitive task, it becomes very important that your physical needs are being met. In 2017, an article appeared written by a colleague of mine at Dublin City University and myself that we called Why Ergonomics Matters to Professional Translators. I've kept true to that title, and this year a special issue of the Interpreter and Translator Trainer is due out, devoted to the topic of ergonomics in translator and interpreter training. So the topic is receiving a lot more interest recently, and we're convinced that the more we talk about this, the more likely it is that people can prevent health problems, prevent discomfort, and we're convinced improve the quality of their work. When you think about ergonomics, what comes to mind? Ergonomics at the workplace, especially in your own setting. We've asked that question many times when we have done professional development courses, when we've worked with our students. And these are some of the responses we get. Chair is a biggie. Posture, back, comfort, productivity, back pain, health, split keyboard, desks, well-being, backache, mouse, a standing desk. We study this word cloud, we realize that people have lots of good insights into what maybe they should be doing. The question is are they really doing that? And what I'd like you to think about as we go through this presentation is, what are you doing to improve the ergonomics of your workplace? And what could you do to do that quite easily? Ergonomics certainly is about the physical conditions of a workplace, but not only. Ergonomics encompasses physical, cognitive, and organizational aspects. Physical, a lot of what we were just looking at in that word cloud captures physical issues, but cognitive issues has to do with when you're working on a computer screen, how easy is it to use your software? How easy is it to see what it is you're looking at it? How complex is that activity? Do you have distractions that are preventing you from concentrating? Organizational ergonomics has to do with, not surprisingly, the organization of the networks that you're involved in, whether that's your own organization or if you're a freelancer, your communication processes with your clients, whether you understand where your text is going to appear or whether you're working in isolation and you're having to make guesses, whether you're being provided with the information you need, and so on. In our work at our institute, we've been talking about language mediation as a cognitive act. And the more we do in this area, the more we realize it's embedded in a complex network that we could argue they're actors and factors Actors has to do with all the people involved, so social aspects, organizational aspects. Factors have to do with, as I mentioned, physical aspects, but also environmental aspects, the temperature, the lighting, whether there's a draft, and all of those, we would argue, contribute to quality or affect quality, but not only, they can also affect your health and your job satisfaction. When you feel that things are working, you have a say in decision making, when your tools are helping you to make good decisions and not hindering you or slowing you down, when you feel comfortable, when you're not hungry, thirsty, or tired, all of that is going to result in better quality. So physical ergonomics is what we usually think about, and the International Ergonomics Association defines it as concerned with human, anatomical, anthropometric, physiological, and biomechanical characteristics as they relate to physical activity. One could argue that there isn't a lot of physical activity happening when you're sitting in front of a computer screen, struggling with how to translate a complex sentence from one language into another. In fact, when we first started doing our research, we were working with occupational therapy researchers, and their normal instruments were not appropriate, and they had to be adapted because when they were observing the professional translators, it didn't look like there was much happening, and they were used to making notes about activities. But of course, there's keyboarding activities, people use a computer mouse, they're sitting, that takes energy to keep yourself in the right posture, and so on. We did a workplace study, observed professional translators at work, as they were translating and revising, and assessments were made of their workplace. Positive aspects was that the ones we observed, most of them had a dedicated workspace. They had a desk size that fit the minimal requirements, they had an adjustable chair, and they had enough leg room, something that is easily forgotten. We need to be able to stretch our legs, and we have to have that room underneath the desk to be able to do that. Negative aspects, that even though people had desks and they had adjustable chairs, elbows often were not level with the desk, which would be the best position for them. So the desk height was not adjustable, which meant that angles were wrong. Normal working angles that would be best for our bodies are not necessarily observed. The chair, although it was adjustable, in most cases had not been adjusted properly, and the person using the chair didn't know how to adjust it properly to fit their own back. Footrests are advised, but they were rarely used. Many of the people we observed had no control over the temperature of their surroundings, and a distracting factor was that they had colleagues moving around. Many of the people we observed, being professional translators working for commercial providers, were working in large offices, in shared offices. The risks, there are risks in terms of accuracy, in terms of translation quality, and of course absenteeism. If people fall sick, if they're not feeling good, the chances are greater that they're not going to be appearing for work as regularly as they should be, or as they would be if conditions were better. I don't know if you recognize yourself in this picture. I certainly did when I first started in this area. I tend to slouch. I have to force myself to sit properly. The occupational therapy researchers were good at explaining to us that people fall into bad habits, and bad habits are particularly difficult to break. And the good habits feel wrong at first. So our body does adapt to things, even if it's not particularly good for our body. And you can study this picture in more detail if you like at your leisure, but there's lots bad about it. And this is a better picture. There are certain things that might not work depending on exactly what you're doing on your computer screen. The position that they recommend may not be right. If you're working in a translation tool where your focus of attention is lower on the screen, then you might need to raise your screen more than what's recommended here. But you see, this person looks like they're in a better position, and indeed, they would be less prone to physical problems. We asked in a large survey whether people had experienced health issues in the last 12 months that were related to translation work. This survey was answered by 1,850 people, and they were translators, or they were involved in translation work, freelance, commercial translators, or people working for institutions. And what you see here may not surprise you. Neck pain, neck stiffness, shoulder pain. We're seeing a lot of reports of that. Pain in the arms or hands, lower back pain, eyes feeling sensitive, impaired vision due to visual fatigue, and other pain in joints, muscles, legs, feet aches, heavy legs. People forget that just sitting can cause strain on the lower body. And having your feet grounded, either on a footstool or on the floor if possible, if you can adjust everything else to work like that, is much better for you long term. In the survey, we included lots of good practice indications, and we asked people whether this was true for them mostly or sometimes or usually. And these are all in green because this is where you want to go. Use a desktop computer for most translation work, meaning not a laptop. That the keyboard would be flat on a desk, not raised, as was very popular for a while. Keyboard shortcuts are being used. This is to reduce keyboarding. 2 screens used for translation work, because with so many different programs open, it's very, very difficult on short-term memory, but also on eyes to be able to focus on so many different things. At least one screen directly in front to reduce neck strain. The screen about an arm's length away. The top of the monitor slightly below eye level. Screen larger than A4. A4 is the normal sized piece of paper. That means if you're working on a laptop, it's probably not much bigger than that. And that the magnification of the screen is adjusted to suit your own needs. I don't know how many of those things work for you. When we asked people to complete these items on this, it wasn't all green. So 90% of the people are saying keyboard shortcuts are used at least sometimes, at least one screen is directly in front, and the screen seems to be of an appropriate size. There were differences between freelancers, commercial translators, and translators working for institutions. If there's a little star, that means there's significant difference. So we have to be a bit careful in generalizing these results to all translators. But there seem to be some areas that really need improvement. People aren't using 2 screens for translation work regularly. Top of the monitor is not necessarily where it should be, and people are not necessarily adjusting the magnification of their screen, whether they just haven't realized this might be an issue. They don't realize how important it could be. It's something really trivial that you could introduce into your own practice if you're operating with default settings that actually don't suit you. The yellow cells are the ones that are things to consider. There's room for improvement. And again, they're very easy to adjust in your own practice. We also, in the survey, asked people what they would like to be more ergonomic. So by the time that people got to the end of our survey, they had a much better idea of what ergonomics was all about. And these were the responses. Again, freelancers, institutional or commercial translators. And what certainly jumped out at us was the chair. A lot of people recognized this was a problem. Anybody who's sitting for long periods of time starts to realize that chair might be a problem. Room temperature, air quality, and noise levels were also concerns. But again, the picture is differentiated depending on which group we're talking about. So you can also think about your own practice and which of those groups you're more likely to relate to, and think about which of those things might be issues for you as well. Staying with good, because it's nicer to think about good than bad, good physical ergonomic practices. If we're talking about a freelancer who can shift positions, who can decide where she's going to sit. If she starts feeling uncomfortable, she can go sit on the couch, or she can sit at the desk for some of her work. There are really good positions, so standing up, for example, to do revision work, sitting properly with feet grounded, the screen right in front of you instead of if she's got her feet cross-legged and leaning forward. It's not to say that one can never do that. If, as I said, you're changing position, that's okay. But our freelancers reported more health issues than the institutional and the commercial translators do. So although they're getting up and moving around, they may be spending extended periods straining and not realizing it. Whereas the institutional and the commercial translators who participated in our workplace study tended to have better equipment. The other aspect of ergonomics I'd like to talk about is cognitive ergonomics. So we're talking about mental processes, perception, memory, reasoning, motor response, as they affect interactions among humans and other elements of a system. So in the case of computer work, we're talking about computers as another element of the system. In our workplace study, people talked about linguistic challenges being positive, domain knowledge challenges. This is the fun stuff about translation. They liked being interrupted by people. They, not all the time, obviously, but they found interruptions by people coming by or phoning that were relevant to their work, or even was just a welcome break, something that helped them. Cat tools, they thought was positive, and they found feedback very positive. Negative aspects, poor quality source text. This came up again and again and again. You may be able to relate to this as well. Monotony as opposed to domain knowledge challenges. So when work becomes monotonous, that's harder to focus. Email interruptions, especially those that have nothing to do with the task at hand. It's a good idea to turn off your email and only turn it on when you're taking a break. Cat tools were considered positive, but there were lots of irritating features of cat tools. One of those was related to crowded screens. That's not necessarily a cat tool feature, but when screens got crowded, then people found they were having trouble sorting out the information. So cognitive overload and time pressure, of course, can affect decision making and cause stress. Again, the risks include problems with accuracy, translation quality, and productivity. So some good practice indications in this area related to cat tools is that you're using cat tools and that they're helpful and you're not having to switch back and forth between different cat tools. Although some people, to the contrary, said they kind of like that change, but if you're having to do it a lot, and especially if it's imposed by someone else, that can be very disruptive. If you customize the aspects of the cat tools to meet your needs, if you don't find them irritating, and for us a good practice indication was when people didn't make any comments about cat tool irritations. That's not what in our survey. Lots of people use cat tools, and of those who used them, 97% said that they were helpful at least sometimes. Rarely or never switch between cat tools, only 64% said it. Customizing aspects of cat tools, that's what people don't seem to be doing, possibly because it seems like more effort than it's worth at first. A lot of people mentioned that they found cat tools irritating, and most of them told us what they found irritating. So this really seems to be an area of concern. We've done some work on this. There's an article that'll be appearing soon, written by my colleague Martin Kapus, myself, where we compared a rather crowded user interface. Some of you may recognize this, where you have segment matches from translation memory and machine translation is matches from term bank. There's the source text on the left-hand side, the target text on the right-hand side, and down in the bottom is where the translator is actually working. And then in this particular constellation, there are also subsegment matches being suggested. Remember, I said that depending on where your focus of interest is in your screen, you may want your screen to be higher than the normal recommendations. And this is a case where we found lots of translators had their monitors raised much higher than we were expecting, than the occupational therapy research especially were expecting. And they explained that that was why, because that's what they were spending their time down there. This is a much leaner interface by a tool that has not been available that long on the market, where there's the source text segment, and then there's space to start writing the target text, and then there's machine translation or translation memory suggestions being presented in gray first, and then exactly the bit of the segment that's being worked on in black for the translator to consider or not. We looked at where people were looking on the screen, so-called heat maps of visual attention, and compared two segments. Each were quite long, and where the focus of attention was when people were translating that particular segment. In the more complex user interface, we can see that most of the attention is in the target text, but there's some attention in the source text, and there's some attention up in the area with the segment matches, the TM and the machine translation suggestions, which means the eyes are having to move around quite a bit. In the other, the leaner interface, we can see that the focus of attention is very smooth, and it's focused primarily on that particular segment, which suggests much less effort on the part of the translator to be looking for information, and possibly much less cognitive load. The on-the-fly subsegment matching that we see can be a case of overload as well. Here, machine translation suggestions are being offered. And what we see here is that things are changing as the translator proceeds, which can be very useful, but again, it can be overload. It's a question of what you find useful in your practice. Sometimes it takes a bit of getting used to, and then you don't want to do without it. And sometimes there are features you don't want to use at all. We see that machine translation and translation memory suggestions are starting to merge. This is from another CAT tool, and we see various kinds of matches, context matches, term-based matches, empty output, fuzzy matches, and subsegment matches. Color has been introduced to try to help the translator or the user decide whether this is to be trusted or not. But you can imagine that this could start turning into overload very easily. Again, it's about customizing the tools to meet your own needs. In our research, at least for learners, at least for students, a lean interface seems to be better. So less is more, less choice, fewer options, less complicated interface. The linguistic resources being close to target test segments seems to be something that's very helpful. What we would recommend is that individualization be made easier. So CAT developers could take this on board. Training institutions could take that on board. Really think about teaching people how to use these tools in a way that works for them. Turning off defaults, choosing alternatives that work. Of course, ideally, translators, professional, active translators would be involved in the development and evaluation of tools, and feedback loops could be incorporated into processes. If developers don't know how these tools are being used in practice, it's very difficult for them to anticipate what the needs will be. Our philosophy is to program machines to give humans the space to do what they do best. Finally, organizational aspects of translation. One organizational aspect has to do with the physical layout of the translator's workplace. That's organizational because how your work is organized, whether you go into a room by yourself, whether you're sharing a space with someone else, can be determined by you, but it might be out of your control. This first picture shows you the translator's desk in red in the middle of a room. There's a window that the translator can look out of. The little blue oval is where the translator is sitting. So the translator needs a bit of a break. She can look out the window. The light falling directly on her may not be good, depending whether that's a south-facing window or not. Another office that we were in, the translator's desk is in red, surrounded by other people sharing an office. This particular office, someone actually had 3 screens. The translator was working on 2 screens, as were 3 of her colleagues. This one we found particularly interesting. This is a larger office. This translator, whose desk is indicated in red, is working with 2 screens. There are a couple plants, that's nice. She's right against a wall, not a whole lot of room to move, but the other colleagues don't seem to have that much room either. None of the other people in the office were translators, very different kinds of work. And because she was the junior member of staff, it was her responsibility to get up every time somebody needed to come into the office. So that arrow you see indicated where the entrance was. And so if somebody knocked on the door, she had to get up and unlock the door to let them in. And there was a printer there too. Might be difficult for this particular translator to concentrate sometimes. So organizational ergonomics is the social technical systems, organizational structures, policies, and processes. In our workplace study, the translators identified personal and remote contact as being positive, institutionalized breaks where they had to take coffee breaks at certain times, where they were expected to take a lunch break. They found that very good because otherwise they probably wouldn't have taken the breaks as regularly. Job security, of course, is very positive. Being able to decide when to work, so flexible working time, is also very positive. Freelancers often have that. Feedback was considered. Negative aspects, workflow design that wasn't efficient, technical problems, infrastructure procurement if someone else decides what tool you're using and you have no say, unrealistic deadlines, translation quality policies that you don't agree with, and low appreciation. Status has been an issue in our profession for a long time and continues to be one. There are risks associated with these negative aspects, of course. Company loyalty is a big one. Companies that want to keep their employees try to keep them happy and find out what they need. Organizational development contributes to that. Good practice indicators, then, not surprisingly, internet connection being good, communication working, workflow software being used, resources provided, feedback, deadlines being clear, time pressure is okay, but not all the time. And the timing of breaks is institutionalized at least sometimes, and hourly breaks are taken at least sometimes. Again, we see there's room for improvement. Some of these things may match your own situation. Other things may be surprises for you. We find various country analyses that we've done, we find the pattern very, very similar. It's not something that was just in one country. This seems to be quite typical of professional translation. So, ergonomics matters. Some practical advice that we would pass on to you. Keep your mouse activity as low as possible by using shortcut keys and arrows. This reduces pressure not only on your lower arm, but also on your shoulder and your neck. Just use the email notice function when you really have to have it. A lot of our freelancers told us that they need to have that on because otherwise they might miss a job. But it can be very, very distracting. So maybe looking at email every half hour and then you get a short break. Having micro breaks is also a very, very good idea. So you could stretch between tasks and then check your email. Learn to recognize warning signs. If you're making typing mistakes, if you're going back to reread something, it may be an indication that your attention is flagging. Might be a good idea to get up and stretch. Think about your own feedback mechanisms. Physical discomfort, a bit of fatigue. If you realize you're shifting on your chair or stool, that probably indicates that you're having problems. I sit on an ergonomic stool, but sometimes I realize I'm shifting a lot. It probably means I should just stand up and stretch. So change position if you can. Proofread a text standing up. If you work with a laptop and a monitor, unplug your laptop and maybe put it on a chest of drawers or a bookshelf and read through something there. Above all, take ownership of the technology you're using. It's yours. It's yours to use as it suits you. So adjust the default settings. Google is a wonderful source of information. The internet is a wonderful source of information on how to adjust almost anything you need. So in general, pay more attention to the ergonomics of your workplace in your own interest. For language technology developers, we suggest they talk to users, especially professionals, about features and usability of tools before, during, and after development. So feedback loop. Test new functionalities with translators and interpreters at the workplace. That's different from in a lab. Facilitate task-related individualization of software settings by making it easier to turn off defaults, because right now, sometimes it's very difficult to turn off a default and come up with a setting that you really want. And for employers and educators, talk about ergonomic issues with your staff and students. Awareness is the first step to improvement. We're always interested in questions, comments, or hearing about your own experiences. Here are some links. You can contact me at maureen.ahrensberger@zhjw.ch if you'd like to start a conversation about this. And I hope you've been able to take away some ideas for your own workplace and your own workplace practices. It's not just me behind all of this. We've been fortunate to be funded by the Swiss National Foundation. We've had industry and institutional partners participating in our studies, lots of translators participating, our ZHW teachers and students, and lots of people participating in the research team and several co-investigators. Thank you for your attention. If you want to have a look at any references, here's a list that might be useful to you.